Good afternoon slash morning slash evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the Black Nonbelievers General Meeting. I'm Mandisa Thomas, for those of you who aren't familiar. And we have a special guest this afternoon, Dr. Sikivu Hutchinson. And before I give the introduction, I'm just going to make a few announcements. First, for those of you who aren't familiar with us, Black Nonbelievers is a nonprofit 501c3 organization headquartered in the Atlanta area that is dedicated to offering a caring, friendly, and informative environment. We connect with Blacks and allies who are living free of religion and who might otherwise be shunned by family and friends. And instead of accepting dogma, we determine truth and morality through reason and evidence. And we started here in Atlanta, but you can now find us nationwide. We have affiliate groups across the country. For more information about how you can participate with us, which right now is mostly through Zoom meetings like this, you may visit our website at blacknonbelievers.org. Thank you very much once again for joining us. I'm still admitting folks here. And just a few more announcements. We do have some major events coming up at the end of 2020 and hopefully for 2021. We are still anticipating on putting on the Women of Color Beyond Belief Conference, and I'm happy to have all of my three co-producers here today, Sikivu being one of them, on this meeting. And we also still have the cruise in November, BNCCon. If you are still interested in attending that, please let me know. Please contact me via our website or met privately through this, through this chat here. Also, we have our 10th anniversary coming up in New Orleans in January of 2021. So we hope you will join us for that. We're going to have an amazing lineup of speakers. We're going to have some great workshops, and we're going to celebrate how far our organization has come in 10 years. And just with the representation here that we see today, which is now worldwide, we're just seeing an enormous amount of growth, and just seeing all the people that we've connected with over the years has just been nothing short of amazing. And once again, we appreciate all of you for hanging in there with us, for growing with us, and we're going to look into doing more for the future, continuing to represent our voices, our demographic, and our community, and make sure that we still remain strong. So one of the things that we do here at Black Nonbelievers, in addition to hosting meetings and events, we feature guest speakers. And I'm very, very happy to feature one of my favorite people in this movement and in this community. She is definitely a sister in arms. If you don't already have her book, Humanists in the Hood, I suggest you pick it up right away. The information is on, you can go to her website. I'm sure she'll give more information on that shortly. So just to introduce Sikivu Hutchinson, she is the founder and president or executive director of Black Skeptics Los Angeles and the Women's Leadership Project. And she's also on the organizing team, along with myself and Bridget Crutchfield, for the Women of Color Beyond Belief Conference. She is also the author of several books, including Humanists in the Hood and the play Narcolepsy, Inc., which premiered at the 2018 Hollywood Fringe Festival. She was also one of the 5 fierce humanists on the cover of the August 2018 issue of the Humanist magazine, which featured, which was the cover article as well, the feature article. And in that, you'll also see myself and Bridget Crutchfield and Candace Gorham. If you don't have your copy, I suggest you also contact the American Humanist Association to get your, your copy of this. So without further ado, I am pleased to welcome you. I'm pleased to welcome Sikivu Hutchinson.
I heard
Hi,
that.
sister.
Bria, hey. And hello, and good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I'm so gratified and pleased to be here. And I just cannot express my boundless appreciation for all of the work that Black Nonbelievers does, being on the front lines, taking the hits, being everywhere globally, having our backs. Mandisa, Bria, and all of the amazing, strong, and momentous African-American women organizers are really just hitting it out of the park, day in, day out. And so to begin the talk, I want to talk a little bit about the legacy that we're building on as Black women, nonbelievers, and free thinkers. And one of the visionaries that I hold near and dear is Alice Walker. I'm going to begin with a quote from her book, In Search of Our Mother's Gardens, because I find refuge, particularly during this time of pandemic turbulence and global uprising, in our centuries-long movement. We have to emphasize that, our centuries-long movement for Black lives. I find refuge in the Black feminist humanist space that she created with In Search of Our Mother's Gardens, which is a 1970s anthology on art, resistance, poetry, and politics. And so she poses the question, what did it mean for a Black woman to be an artist in our grandmother's time, in our great-grandmother's day? It is a question with an answer cruel enough to stop the blood. Did you have a genius of a great-great-grandmother who died under some ignorant and depraved white overseer's lash? Or was she required to bake biscuits for a lazy backwater tramp when she cried out in her soul to paint watercolors of sunsets or the rain falling on the green and peaceful pasture lands? Or was her body broken and forced to bear children who were more often than not sold away from her? 8, 10, 15, 20 children, when her one joy was the thought of modeling heroic figures of rebellion in stone or clay. In her essay in the same anthology, Saving the Life That Is Your Own, she said, in my work, I write not only the things that I want to read, understanding fully and indelibly that if I don't do it, no one is vitally interested. I write all the things I should have been able to read. And so Humanists in the Hood is the book that I should have been able to read. It's the book that I have written in homage to the unsung and the invisible visionaries and artists and writers and thinkers that Alice Walker evokes in her work. I've written all my life. It's really been one of my primary sources of Black joy. And I want to underscore the importance of Black joy in this era when our children are constantly being subjected to the travesty, the atrocity of Black bodies and Black lives being decimated every second of every minute of every hour, filmed and televised like this is the normal regime of our existence. So it's been the solace, it's been a refuge and an antidote really to going insane with rage and despair in a world that feeds off of Black women's creativity, that wrings us out and leaves us for dead. Recently, I had a talk with a young writer who is in my Women's Leadership Project program in South LA, and she goes to King Drew Medical Magnet, a high achieving, predominantly African-American Latinx school. And she talked about really being impassioned about writing fiction. But she also said that she was ashamed because the majority of her characters, her protagonists, were white folks. And so I confessed to her that as an elementary school student, when I first started out trying to write novels, one of my first lead protagonists was this young white rich boy who wanted to run away from home and join a street gang. And so she and I sort of laughed and commiserated over that incongruity. But in my mind, this kind of indoctrination is just as much a part of the war on Black people that informs the BL movement as the carceral state nexus of police and jails and courts It's part of this decolonizing of Black minds that we as Black writers have to be given the tools to resist and disrupt. And essentially, as a Black writer, I feel that being given those tools comes through our heritage and our legacy of resistance and struggle, and constantly having to battle destroying the white gaze and learning how to bury its embers and its ashes. The opening lines of Humanists in the Hood read, quote, "I came to feminism as a baby atheist growing up in South LA." And to continue, I say, my first pangs of unapologetic godlessness were in Catholic school, sitting in dreary religion classes run by sanctimonious white male teachers made me despise the Bible, its moral hypocrisies, and its violent woman-hating language. It was inane to me that a centuries-old, quote, good book could dictate that I remain silent, bow down to patriarchs, step back as chattel, and view my body as an impure vessel of original sin, redeemable only through self-sacrifice and submission to a male deity. It was madness that these atrocities could be justified by the unquestioned moral righteousness of a Christian tradition that condoned slavery, rape, and homophobia. It was clear to me that much of the policing of femininity that I and other girls encountered had a strong basis in Christian religious dogma. From the moment we're assigned the female gender at birth, girls' sexuality is a commodity, an object, an asset, and a liability to be marketed, bought, sold, and controlled in a birth to death cycle in which girls and women are straitjacketed by a litany of do's and mostly don'ts. Don't sit this way, walk this way, talk this way, dress this way, don't go there, hang out with them, drink, smoke, act like a bitch, act like a hoe, act like a dude, get yourself raped or knocked up. And when you get older, supposedly beyond the regime of the sexualizing male gaze, don't ever think you will be relevant, whether you have kids or not. The Catholic school that I went to for 1 year was a perfect training ground for this dance of invisibility. In the Reagan years, it was widely viewed by some middle-class Black and Latinx parents as a so-called antidote to the quote-unquote bad schools in South LA and neighboring Inglewood, which was then a predominantly Black community that had been largely white up until the late 60s. Then as now, private religious schools were microcosms of a segregated two-tier educational system. Middle-class and working-class parents of color, desperate to give their children a leg up, bus them to elite schools, hoping against hope that the racial tensions that fueled post-Brown v. Board of Education desegregation battles wouldn't affect their babies. And so growing up as a baby atheist in South LA would seem to be contradictory, to fly in the face of conventional wisdom about who atheists are, who feminists are, where they live, and how they imagine themselves. Because in the popular imagination, as many of you know, folks of color, South LA is monolithically deemed to be South Central. It's this dangerous shithole of police helicopters and crime and drugs and pathology and gangs and drive-bys, which is effectively, in the mind of the mainstream, a universe away from this sun-kissed California myth that has been drilled into the collective unconscious of the nation. And it was really important to me in this book to be intentional about claiming where we live and the cultural and political specificity of our communities and neighborhoods. The hood part of the book's title comes from my lived experience, working, writing, teaching, raising a family, and being while Black in resilient communities of color that are, again, a wormhole away from these privileged realities of Southern California white folks across the class and religious spectrum. I really wanted to foreground our communities in humanist discourse because so often these local political and material conditions of Black lives are invisibilized. And when I was born at the tail end of the turbulent 60s, Black people were being decimated by COINTELPRO, by the Vietnam War, by the fallout after the 1965 Watts Rebellion, and by insidiously what Black feminist activist Aisha Shahida Simmons, who was a friend and colleague, has dubbed the pandemic within a pandemic, that is sexual violence and abuse that's happening every day, every hour to Black women and girls, is erased, is propped up by religion, patriarchy, and misogynoir, which is anti-Black misogyny, which is embedded in our schools, in our homes, in our churches, and in our neighborhoods. And in chapter 2, I address how back in the day, we did not have the language to talk about the impact this pandemic had upon our psyches, our bodies, and our lives. We were sworn effectively to silence by this regime and this hierarchy of Black male respectability, and Black pastors and Black authority figures and Black women enforcing respectability, protecting patriarchy to the death. And so fast forward to today, and we're still in conditions of apartheid, where traditional state violence has morphed into COVID-based state suppression, surveillance, and lynching, and not just with the murders of Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery and George Floyd and Tony McDade, and the young man who was recently executed by police there in Atlanta, but also in the police terrorism that we have seen against demonstrators. Over the past week, we've seen this global multiracial uprising with young whites flooding the streets, chanting BLM, advocating for the defunding of police. And these are nice and welcome sentiments, and I'm going to be cynical about it, and pose the question, what are these folks, newly woke, many of them, going to do when they go back to their hyper-segregated white enclaves or to their hyper-gentrified enclaves where Black folks are being displaced and dispossessed en masse? I argue that we cannot erase this legacy of white supremacy that emerges from, for example, if we're looking at it in the Southern California context, the scores of white folks who were able to migrate from white middle American strongholds in Illinois, in Iowa, in Indiana, by dint of New Deal social welfare entitlements and institutions like the Federal Housing Administration, which systematically redlined Black folks in urban inner city communities and excluded Black folks from home mortgage loans, and by dint of that, the suburban American dream, like the GI Bill that ushered scores and scores of white European American returning GIs into the middle class, into home equity and affluence. They built their American dream on the backs of Black folks who were excluded from these vaunted New Deal social welfare entitlement programs, which were effectively a form of white affirmative action. And so these historical fault lines define the whiteness of every white person in America across class and religion. I don't care if you're a white Satanist, or you're a white atheist, or you're a white fundamentalist evangelical theocrat. We know that the majority of the leadership of secular organizations, of course, is white and middle class, and that this bias reflects their agendas. This is what we've been resisting, as Mandisa alluded to, over the past decade and more. We know that white secularists are not being displaced from their homes due to market rate rents and skyrocketing mortgage prices and falling incomes and now COVID layoffs. They don't face the dilemma of whether to send their children to segregated schools with greater police presence than counselors, than after-school programs, than essential mental health and welfare services, or to ship them to private white schools where they will be marginalized, dehumanized, and criminalized anyway. And so as COVID ravages our communities, this divide between white America and Black America has never been wider. Black folks are tired and done, frankly, with giving out roadmaps to proverbial well-intentioned white folks in the secular movement and in our workplaces. And so on page 29, getting back to the politics and the ecosystem within the secular movement, I say for humanists of color, this willful ignorance on the part of the white secular community is merely a reflection of the violence that normalizes racial segregation in the United States. White humanists who cling to myths of objectivity actively benefit from economic apartheid in wealth accumulation, employment, and access to public space. They largely control the discourse on what is considered to be, quote, humanist and secular in mainstream forums about movement organizing, public policy, and outreach. They capitalize on the wages of whiteness, which is W.E.B. Du Bois's term for the public and psychological wage that confers white folks with economic and political privilege. By divorcing secularism from the intersectional lived experiences and social histories of people of color for whom church-state separation, particularly when it pertains to education, LGBTQI enfranchisement, and reproductive justice, is fundamentally linked to economic justice. In this regard, secular people of color remain alienated from European American humanism and do not perceive it as a viable base for coalition building within liberal progressive politics. One of the ways that this neo-indentured servitude plays out is in the intellectual labor that Black women in particular, and women of color in general, are supposed to provide for white accomplices, white allies, white co-conspirators, white gatekeepers. And this is near and dear to me because I come from a job in local county government where my status as this angry negress heathen has led to my being passed over numerous times in favor of white women who are essentially pimping social justice by aligning themselves with the issues and the causes and the initiatives that are being spearheaded within communities of color. And so they are able to shimmy their way up the corporate or public sector ladder by dint of our pain and our experiences and our social capital. These individuals then become the gatekeepers of so-called minority culture and use this as an access and stepping stone for career advancement. And if we look at feminism, the contemporary iterations of it, this is actually a poll that we did just as a little digression with Black Skeptics in 2015 that I'll come back to on some of the major issues that Black secularists in our community wanted to see addressed. But in confronting these schisms within feminism and this veneer of interracial feminist solidarity, some of you may recall this popular hashtag that emerged 2015, 2016, called Solidarity is for White Women. And so it was essentially calling out white feminist complicity and silence with racism. And in the first two chapters of the book, I discuss how Black feminism has always been in resistance to first wave and second wave feminism, and how first wave secular free-thinking feminists like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Ernestine Rose were abolitionists, were supposedly down with Black liberation struggle, but at the same time were propping up this agenda in their resistance to the 15th Amendment, for example, this agenda by saying that they had their own special white woman's burden. And essentially carving out this space of racism, nationalism, and xenophobia, and touting themselves as the bearers of civilized values over backward ex-slaves and immigrants. And so we fast forward to the 20th century, And there was this divide in early second wave feminism between white feminists, primarily coming from a middle-class background, carving out this space of feminine mystique, which is obviously a reference to Betty Friedan's founding canonical second wave feminist work, wanting to bust out of the shackles and the limitations of their domestic kitchens and their cloistered lives, being wives and caregivers and mothers, but at the same time being blithely unaware, supposedly, that these very same kitchens and these protected domains were in fact being protected and being propped up by the labor and the capital of African-American women, the suppressed capital of African-American women, who had to work in these kitchens without the benefit of overtime, without the benefit of any type of protections or quote unquote combat pay for being systematically sexually abused by the male relatives, the husbands, the fathers, the brothers, and the cousins of these white women yearning to be free from the shackle of domesticity. And so we've always had to confront, as Black feminists, that manifest contradiction and the violence of that erasure. This is a statement from the COMBAHEE River Collective, which was an African-American women's movement that was founded in the 1970s to surface these intersections. It was socialist, it was based upon dismantling the carceral state and the impact that it was having on the lives of African-American women and girls. And they say Black women's extremely negative relationship to the American political system, a system of white male rule, has always been determined by our membership in two oppressed racial and sexual castes. Many more Black women who do not define themselves as feminists have all experienced sexual oppression as a constant factor in our day-to-day existence. They then shout out white women's racism and supremacy. And it's important to underscore that they were spearheaded by a collective of African-American women lesbians, named after Harriet Tubman's 1863 raid and uprising on the Combahee River, where she liberated 750 enslaved people. And so in this millennial Beyonce, Ariana Grande feminism age, this divide between Black women and white female respectability is gargantuan. We see it with the lynchings of scores of Black women and girls, like Ayanna Jones, Tatiana Jefferson, Sandra Bland, and Breonna Taylor, just to name a few. We see it with the mass incarceration and sexual abuse to prison pipelining of Black girls, and the fact that many of our so-called blue-collar essential workers are Black women who are expected to, on the one hand, caregive Black children, Black men, and white people, while putting their lives on the line for their jobs in their communities. As a Black girl sexual violence survivor, SEIU local shop steward, and parent of a non-binary child, my humanism has always been grounded in the here and now feminism of the everyday, because many of us, again, grew up in and continue to live in communities that are predominantly religious. We move through our communities as perpetual heathen outsiders, even as we work and collaborate with faith-based folks of color by necessity. We grew up seeing how destructive the Bible and Christian dogma were to Black women's self-determination, especially as an enforcer of this regime of endless caregiving, endless sacrifice, endless domestic violence and intimate partner violence, and putting Black men and patriarchy first at all costs. In the midst of the hashtag #MeToo movement, or its appropriation by celebrity white women. We see corrupt churches and predatory male faith leaders dominating our communities, sucking up investment dollars, sucking up funding that is going to so-called faith-based initiatives. And I place this within the context of the mega billions that the 1% are looting, most recently and egregiously through the CARE Act, as we have seen, but also through the ongoing regime of tax loopholes and benefits to CEOs and their shareholders. And of course, is manifest in the destruction of unionized workplaces by dint of the 2018 Janus Supreme Court decision. And so these policies are also a form of state violence. They go hand in hand with carceral state divestment in communities of color, or from communities of color. In the wake of George Floyd's murder, the BLM coalition has renewed the generations old call for the defunding and eventual abolition of police. And so the hashtag care not cages and the hashtag care not cops have become prevalent, have reverberated across the nation as folks challenge divestment from Black communities and the regime of policing. And I've been writing about policing as an organizer and educator for over 2 decades, first in Bellingham, Washington, in New York, and now in LA. And the hood piece of my book also reflects the fact that under these conditions of pandemic, African-American and Latinx incarcerated folks are also on the front lines, have been given a death sentence in our prisons and juvenile detention facilities, are disproportionately contracting COVID and dying from COVID. 45% of those who are in LA County jails currently are languishing there, not because they've been convicted of a crime, but because they cannot afford bail. And so increasingly, the insidiousness of all of these strands of inequity and oppression are becoming more and more manifest in our communities. Here in LA, for example, we have an African-American female district attorney who is a national scourge, who refuses to prosecute killer cops, who fortunately is up for re-election, and we have a very good chance to get her ass out of office. We have a county government that has systematically underfunded and divested from African-American communities, particularly if we're looking at critical programs like prisoner reentry resources, like after-school programs, like drug rehab programs, and domestic violence prevention and intervention programs. And we know that faith-based organizations, as I alluded to before, are front row and center when it comes to doling out public dollars for these kinds of social welfare infrastructure initiatives. Secular humanist organizations can absolutely play a role in disrupting this regime, particularly when it comes to the indoctrination of millennial and Gen Z youth who are being funneled into these kinds of insidious faith-based programs. The final chapter of my book is called Gen Secular, and it addresses the connection between the rise of secularism among younger generations and the increase in the number of young folks who are actively and unapologetically identifying as queer, as trans, and non-binary. These young folk have been out in the streets, they've been on the front lines, they've been putting their bodies on the line. They have also been organizing in creative ways on TikTok, on Instagram, some of them expressing their activism by refusing to say the Pledge of Allegiance, taking a knee in homage to the Black Lives Resistance movement or an homage to their non-belief. Some of them are at the forefront of racial and gender justice and working to end child sexual abuse and the criminalization and push out of queer, trans, and non-binary African-American youth in particular, who have some of the highest rates of homelessness, some of the highest rates of being pushed out of their homes due to this nexus of discrimination and prejudice, transphobia and homophobia and trans antagonism. On page 115, I write, as greater numbers of millennial and Gen Z youth of color move away from organized religion and faith-based belief, the challenge for humanism in an increasingly divided economy will be even more pronounced. Many of these new generation nuns are looking for a worldview anchored in a secularist ethics that is explicitly anti-racist, anti-sexist, and non-binary, while having a clear perspective on the need to address economic inequality. And many of these youth still struggle to be seen in a context where non-belief, humanism, and skepticism are vilified by communities of color on the one hand, and commandeered by the atheist version of white nationalists on the other. And so our challenge to mainstream humanism and white supremacy is the same: to write the books that we should have been able to read, to build our own institutions, to organize, and to remain visible and vigilant. These are some of the young people who were recipients of the 2016 Black Skeptics First in the Family Humanist Scholarship. And this is a scholarship that we have offered for the past 7 years. And it focuses on young people of color who identify as secular, atheist, free-thinking, and skeptic and humanist, as well as young folks who are undocumented, LGBTQI identified, foster care assigned, system involved, and unhoused. And so the next deadline is coming up quite soon on June 26th. Encourage everyone who knows of a young person who has just graduated from high school, who's going to a 2 or 4 year college or university, and who identifies as secular or is in one of the categories that I've cited, to apply for the scholarship. It is a $5,000 scholarship this year. It's being sponsored, and we're giving 4 of them. It's being sponsored by the Freedom from Religion Foundation. And we have been very gratified to have Black Nonbelievers as a supporter over the past 7 years of this scholarship. Getting back to the slide where I referenced some of the priorities for Black skeptics, community members, we have critical thinking, but also secular alternatives for social issues, LGBTQI, youth, et cetera, redressing the school to prison pipeline in an education curriculum. And the reason why I'm scrolling back to that particular slide is to foreground that for over 14 years, we have been engaged in this movement building among young women of color, African American and Latinx, through the Women's Leadership Project program, which is based in South LA, which started out really in the early 2000s at Audubon Middle School and Clay Middle Schools in Southwest LA. And our focus is on Black feminists and feminists of color civic engagement, mentoring, and advocacy in these programmatic areas. We're still going strong despite countywide, citywide divestment from this program, despite the misogynist attacks that we've had on this program and on the lives of the girls that are in the program. These are some of the initiatives that we have embarked upon over the past 3 years. The Future of Feminism Conference, which is facilitated by African American and Latinx young women, as well as the sexual harassment campaign, sexual harassment prevention campaign that we spearheaded before Me Too exploded in early 2016. I also want to give a shout out again to our seminal conference, the Women of Color Beyond Belief conference that we launched last year successfully with over 100 women of color, non-believers, skeptics, free thinkers, and humanists, the first ever. And this was launching off of our Five Fierce Humanists magazine that Mandisa alluded to before. That took quite a bit of doing. We can talk about why that was. That was not something that was beneficently dreamed up by the editorial board of the Humanists. We pushed for that, and it was the first of its kind. And this is another picture of our scholars from 2015, I believe. Most of these young people are graduating now. Yes. This is information on how to get the book. I want to just wrap up with a beautiful quote, bringing it full circle, from Alice Walker in In Search of Our Mother's Gardens. And so she says on the issue of creativity, how is the creativity of the Black woman kept alive year after year and century after century, when for most of the years Black people have been in America, it was a punishable crime for a Black person to read or write, and the freedom to paint, to sculpt, to expand the mind with action did not exist. Then you may begin to comprehend the lives of our, quote, crazy, sainted mothers and grandmothers, the agony of the lives of women who might have been poets, novelists, essayists, and short story writers over a period of centuries, who died with their real gifts stifled within them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sikivu, for that wonderful presentation. For those of you who are just joining us for the first time, if you have never, ever seen any of us speak before, I mean, many of us really do, you know, we really do talk about the systemic issues that we face in the United States and globally. We've been saying this, I don't know for how long. And hopefully, as you read Sikivu's book, and as you consider, you know, everything that you heard today, everything that we continue to speak on, and that everything we continue to present, especially from our demographic, you take it in, and like Sikivu said, just not expecting to just be educated, but learning on your own and also supporting the work that we do. And so I think we have a few minutes for questions. Will that be okay, Sikivu?
Yeah, that'll be fine. If we could wrap around 4 your time, I believe.
Yep. So
Yeah.
Sikivu will be on until 4 o'clock, and then we'll continue on with the meeting. After that, there are a number of us, if you'd like to stick around for that portion. For those of you who came in late, we are recording this meeting, so you can catch the portions that you missed on our YouTube page. So if you have a question, please use the icon to raise your hand or just type it into the chat box on the okay, so we have one question from Dragnot, and the question is, and I know we've heard this before, what do you suggest to non-POC who asks what can they do to help POC in their area? And I'm just going to modify that to help POC, period. People.
Right. So we have gotten this quite a bit. And what I will say is, in the immediate, those who are coming from a secular humanist, free thought, atheist position, support Black nonbelievers, support Black skeptics, support the Black nonbelievers and humanists of Sacramento, support communities of color that are steeped in the very issues that we see expanding globally when it comes to inequities. So, for example, we talked about specific initiatives that we've been doing. You know, here in South LA, there are specific initiatives that Black nonbelievers has been doing. And it's not just convening conferences, it's working with our people day in and day out, providing them with mental health and wellness resources, providing them with culturally responsive professional development and training, providing folks with the type of skills, tools, and knowledge that they need to be pipelined into jobs, into higher education, as opposed to prisons and juvenile facilities. So that's my short answer.
Thank you very much, Sikivu. Does anyone else have a question? Okay, we have a question from Debbie Allen with the Secular Coalition for America. As someone who wishes to be a white ally and as a very white woman in a leadership role within the secular community, what recommendations do you have for helping us set an appropriate agenda for legislative lobbying at the nation's capital?
Okay, so from the perspective of the Secular Coalition, one area that you can address immediately, which I'm quite sure you've already embarked upon, is reproductive justice access, and the fact that African American women, Indigenous and Latinx women are less likely to have equitable access to contraception, to HIV and STI, STD screening, to abortion, to a whole complement of mental health and wellness resources. That's one key critical area, which obviously is very essential when we're talking about trying to dismantle theocratic oppression in the United States. But I would also recommend buying Humanist in the Hood, because there are some concrete prescriptions for pursuing a public policy agenda.
Okay, so I have Arsenio up, and you're unmuted right now, Arsenio. Would you like to ask your question, or please unmute right now?
Yeah. So basically, like I struggle. Like I try to be like open minded and stuff, but it's hard for me. Like I'm schizophrenic. Like, and like now like the spirit. Well, it's actually some other things happen to me, but like the spirit right now is like saying like like trans people and like gay people are like out to get you. And but I actually talked on the phone with a trans girl, and I was like, can I get some oral sex? And I'm not trying to like destroy the mean or be mean or nothing, so but I'm just being honest. So but like I don't like I feel like there's a plot to get me to turn like gay, and I don't want to be that. And I like when people come around me like that are gay, like I try to be respectful, but I feel like that natural spirit of them like hitting on me, like I don't want that. You know what I mean?
Okay,
like,
I'm going to stop you right there, because is there a question in that? Is there a question that you have for Sikivu regarding that?
Yeah, like has anybody like ever like brought that kind of like thought, like has anybody like expressed that concern, like where you're trying to be like open-minded and accepting and like tolerant and stuff like that of other people?
Okay, so I'm going to stop that. I'm just going to reiterate that Black Nonbelievers as an organization and as our allies are very pro-LGBTQ, which includes the trans community. We are a very evidence and verified based organization. So we encourage people who may be feeling like that to perhaps seek some sort of help and support, because most trans people are not out to get you. If I may answer that for Sikivu. Sikivu may want to answer that very quickly. If you do, that's fine. If you don't, that's fine as well, because we do have a couple of more questions here.
No, I think that type of trans antagonism is extremely problematic, and that's what we've been fighting against. So
right. It's also very much a byproduct of the supremacist and systemic racism and and issues that have been implemented. So you might want to definitely consider that. Just as a FYI. I know it's pretty new, but I'm going to move on to the next question. There, you're muted, Arsenio, so we can't hear you. So Uday, who is out of India, he asked, how does the judicial system in the U.S. protect Black women from abuse or sexual assault? Are there any special laws enacted?
Special laws for Black women?
No.
No.
No, we can answer that too.
No, so in a word, no, but also to nuance it, if we look at the interaction of African-American women with the criminal justice system, it has been extremely oppressive and misogynorists, which again is anti-Black misogyny, African American women have always been considered to be quote unquote unrapeable vis-a-vis white women. And so we have never been afforded the full rights and quote unquote privileges under the criminal justice system that white women and white bodies have. African American women are more likely not to contact the police when they've been violated and sexually abused or sexually harassed because of this issue of the way in which Black women have been perceived to be hypersexual Jezebels. So we're always being dehumanized as more oversexed, as if we look at Black girls, adultified and not worthy of the same rights as white women. And even when we do make the crimes committed upon us known to law enforcement, we are more likely to be criminalized. So it's a vicious cycle.
Yes, so there's one, thank you, Sikivu. So there is another question by Dean Bedekar, who asks, why are people like Ben Carson silent? Have they been co-opted? Now, as someone who doesn't depend on like high profile people to sort of speak on our issues, because he is very much a Christian, yeah, I'd like for you, if you'd like to answer that question a bit more succinctly about someone like Ben Carson.
Ben Carson is an unreconstructed Christian fascist who is basically suffering from internalized white supremacy. And he has been for a while. So we need to separate his quote unquote brilliant career as a forerunning neurosurgeon from the absolute disaster and debacle of his tenure in the Trump regime. Ben Carson has been against social justice, against anti-racism, against trying to address mass incarceration, against doing anything constructive for Black folks that are in public housing. He has absolutely wrecked HUD, the Housing and Urban Development Department. So Ben Carson is not someone that African Americans are looking to for any type of substantive leadership, guidance, and vision. He's a sellout, he's an Uncle Tom, he's a handkerchief head.
And there you have it. So, you know, for those of you who thought that we all agreed on everything, that isn't true at all. The Black community has always we have a legacy of, you know, intellectual discourse, you know, dissent, as we are still overcoming from, you know, the systemic oppression, we are recognizing our humanity. We recognize our humanity and our ability to disagree and to call out those who really have their own self-serving agendas, and who have used that. And, you know, I will say for myself that, you know, Ben Carson is an extreme disappointment of, he's been very, very a prime example of disappointment in someone who can be so brilliant in one area and then just awful everywhere else. And, you know, that just goes without saying. So before Sikivu goes, you know, once again, I'd like to thank her for joining us for this portion of our general meeting. Please do purchase her book at her website, SekivuHutchinson.com. Please do, you know, please do look up Black Skeptics Los Angeles and support the work that they do. Of course, you may visit Black Nonbelievers website. Both of our organizations are 501c3s, so donations to us are tax deductible. I will hold up the issue of the Humanist magazine once again that we were all featured on, which was Sikivu Hutchinson, Bridget Crutchfield, who was also on this meeting. You have Candace Gorham, who will be next month's guest speaker, and Liz Ross, out of who was originally from LA but who is now in the Miami area. So that article is still available on the Humanist website. So we'd like to thank Sikivu once again for joining us. Are there any last words you have before you go?
Yeah, I just wanted to note that anyone who wants to purchase the book, if you could specify that you attended the session, and proceeds from the book are going to go, half of the proceeds from the book sales generated from this talk will go to Black nonbelievers. So hopefully that incentivizes some purchases, and we just want to keep our support platform and mutual admiration society going.
Absolutely. Thank you. You heard her. Please do mention that you were at this general meeting if you purchase Humanists in the Hood. And half of the proceeds will benefit our organization, which, as always, uplifts the voices of Black atheists, secularists, people who are questioning religion in favor of leaving, as well as increasing our representation in overall society. So thank you all very, very much. Thank you, Sikivu. This is going to be the next hour is just going to be general conversation. So, you know, if you like to talk, just please raise your hand. I always have trouble finding that portion of it. So,